So as we look at Second Corinthians, again, we want to review. We're looking at the life and writings of the Apostle Paul. We looked at the book of Acts that provides us historical foundation for Paul's epistles. And in the book of Acts, we saw the first missionary journey that took place. This is a map of that first missionary journey where Paul and Barnabas traveled throughout South Galatia area, modern day Turkey there, and they're on Cyprus. And after that first missionary journey, then Paul wrote the book of Galatians. That was the first book that we studied, and we're studying these in the order in which they were revealed to us, that God led the Apostle Paul to record these epistles. And so Galatians was that first epistle written by Paul. And let's put it on the board here as we walk through trying to think through key word to remember. What would be the key word to remember for Galatians? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Justification, right? Justification. That's what the book of Galatians is all about. That we are once and for all declared righteous by God when we receive Christ's righteousness, that salvation is by grace through faith alone. And that's the issue that was a problem in the churches there in South Galatia. These Judaizers who are trying to impose the law upon them. And Paul writes to say, no, we are saved by grace through faith, and we are sanctified by grace through faith. The works of the law do not contribute to our salvation, and they can't sanctify us either. Right? And so that was the first epistle Paul wrote after his first missionary journey. And then the book of Acts records Paul's second missionary journey. And we looked at that where Paul and Silas goes over to Macedonia, this northern part of Greece, and established churches in Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea. Then he goes down to Athens and Corinth. And from Corinth, Paul writes his second epistle. And we remember that Paul stood before Gallio, the judgment seat, the bema of Gallio. And Acts 18 tells us that. And so that gives us a very fixed historical point because of the Delphi inscription. Remember the Delphi inscription that mentions Gallio, this archaeological discovery that mentions that Gallio was in Corinth as a proconsul. So when we overlap what the book of Acts tells us about Paul being in Corinth and being brought before Gallio at the judgment seat there, and then we add the archaeological discovery of the Delphi inscription that gives us a very specific AD 51 date for when Paul was in Corinth. And so he writes First Thessalonians from Corinth back to a church that he had established recently, just weeks before, and he writes First Thessalonians. So he's writing from Corinth, he's writing to Thessalonica, and that's why it's called First Thessalonians. And what is the key word or subject First Thessalonians deals with? That's right, the rapture, right? Okay, it's dealing with the doctrine of the future eschatology. The rapture is the catching up. That's the Latin word raptura is where we get that doctrinal word, theological word we use. And so First Thessalonians is the catching up of believers that Paul teaches them. And then after writing First Thessalonians, Paul writes Second Thessalonians shortly thereafter. And what's the key word we want to associate with Second Thessalonians, or key phrase? Okay, the day of the Lord. And remember in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 2, it's apparent that these Thessalonian believers were told, and there's maybe a letter as if from Paul. It's not from Paul, but someone pretending to be Paul has written them, and Paul, it's saying that they are in the day of the Lord, that they are in this time of tribulation. And Paul says, no, you're not. I know you're going through great trials and tribulations, but it's not the hour of trial or the day of the Lord. Several things must come before that, right? The lawless one must be revealed. We talked about that being the Antichrist. The restrainer must be removed. I think that's referring to the rapture of the church. And an apostasy must occur. That's all in 2 Thessalonians 2. Okay? And so the next epistle that is written will be written later. We've looked at that. So on Paul's third missionary journey, he stays in Ephesus for about 3 years. And again, we're thankful for Luke, Dr. Luke, who recorded the book of Acts and recorded all of this historical information. And that's why we started with the book of Acts, because it provides that foundation as we're going through these different epistles. And so while Paul's in Ephesus, he's there for about 3 years on his third missionary journey, he writes First Corinthians to the Corinthian church. And First Corinthians deals with a lot of subjects, but for the sake of memory and understanding, what's the key word we're thinking with First Corinthians? That's right, unity, right? Unity. And in First Corinthians, the beginning of First Corinthians, remember Chloe's household, someone from Chloe's household has written Paul and has told Paul that the church has a lot of disunity. Some are saying, I'm of Paul. Others, I'm of Apollos. I'm of Cephas, Peter. And others, in a pious way, I'm of Christ. Right? Yeah, so disunity would be the problem. And Paul's calling them to be unified, right? Be of one mind. Right? Good. So the core problem is disunity. They're taking each other to the law, again, to court in public venues of unbelieving magistrates. There's immorality amongst them. There's fighting and disputing, and Paul addresses them there. And then last week, or 2 weeks ago, while Paul's also in Ephesus, he probably wrote Romans about the same time, 55, 56, to a church that he's never visited. Right? Remember that? He says, I want to come to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift. But he's not visited them, not been able to get to them yet. And he's probably writing at the same time, around AD 55, 56. And what's the key word for Romans? That's gospel. That's right, gospel. And it begins with first in Romans 1, 16 and 17, right? The gospel is the power of salvation. And so Romans is unpackaging this incredible doctrine of salvation by grace through faith, but he begins with condemnation, right? That the whole world is condemned, that Jews and Gentiles are all condemned. Remember, Gentiles are condemned because of creation around us, points to a creator. We look at nature all around us, and it's one of the 2 ways that God reveals himself to every single person born in this world. Nature around us points to a creator, and the moral law, knowledge of right and wrong. We all know innately the murder's wrong. We all know innately that child abuse is wrong. We all know that stealing is wrong. Well, how do we know? Well, God has put it within us to know that. And so Paul argues that every single person born in this world has general revelation. That is, revelation available to every single person that has mental capacity to understand it. Right? And that includes nature, creation, that includes the law, the moral law within us. There's no explanation for the moral law. Atheists don't have an explanation for it. Right? And so the very arguments that Paul makes just in Romans 1 and 2 are still the strongest apologetical arguments today. They're still used today, and I think they're still helpful. So Paul says Gentiles are condemned because of those 2 things. Jewish people are condemned because of the special revelation in the Old Testament they have. They had the prophets. They had the 10 commandments. They had the written law in addition to the moral law and creation around us. Right? And so Paul argues that the whole world is condemned. And so general revelation is enough to condemn, but it's not enough to save, is it? We need special revelation. And so Paul, after arguing that every person born in this world stands condemned, then he argues that we need this message of Christ. How can they hear unless we send a messenger? Blessed are the feet of those who bring good news, right? That we are the means by which God communicates the message of the gospel to others. And so that's Paul's argument. The gospel, condemnation, and then justification. We're declared righteous. It really complements Romans does. that we're declared righteous by God through faith in Christ. And then Paul develops the sanctification process, this process of us becoming more like Christ. And we look forward to the day where we will finally realize glorification, where we receive our glorified bodies, where we will be like Christ in his resurrected state. Okay. And so the book of Romans is all about the gospel. And so today we are to 2 Corinthians, which would have been written shortly after Paul's departure from Ephesus. He's going to go on into Macedonia. On the third missionary journey, after being in Ephesus for about 3 years, he goes on to Macedonia. And at some point while in Macedonia, he writes 2 Corinthians. And that's what we're looking at today. All right, 2 Corinthians. Paul's had a lot of interactions with this church. There's a lot of different interactions with this church, more than any other church. Paul spends more time in Ephesus than he does in Corinth, but Paul was in Corinth for about 1.5 years, Acts 18, before he was drugged before Gallio. Then he stayed many days after that. And so he was over 1.5 years in Corinth, but Paul was 3 years in Ephesus, but Paul had more interactions with the Corinthian church than any other church that we have record of. The founding visit that Paul established the church is found in Acts 18, right? Again, that was on his second missionary journey. And then 1 Corinthians, we looked at this several weeks back. In 1 Corinthians 5:9, Paul refers to his former letter to the Corinthian church. And so 1 Corinthians 5:9 alludes to that. And so what we call 1 Corinthians, actually 2 Corinthians, because we don't have record of 1 Corinthians. Paul alludes to it, an epistle, a letter that he wrote, but it didn't survive. Right? It didn't survive antiquity. We don't have it. God did not choose to preserve it. It wasn't necessary for the church to have. But Paul refers to, it talks about immorality in that letter because he says, when I wrote you not to associate with immoral people, I didn't speak of those who are of the world, right? Because that wouldn't be possible unless you left the world, Paul says. Verse 11, but actually I wrote to you not to associate with any so-called brother or some professing brother if he's an immoral person, right? Or an adulterer or drunkard. Right? So Paul's saying, you misunderstood what I said in my previous letter. And he's saying that he was not talking about people in the world who are unbelievers, but was speaking of this particular immoral brother, I think. Then we learn in 1 Corinthians 1:11 that Paul received correspondence from Chloe's household. So again, this is interaction between Paul and the church in Corinth. So Chloe's household contacted Paul and informed him. Verse 11, for I've been informed concerning you, my brethren, by Chloe's people. Some translations translate it Chloe's household. I think that would be accurate. That there are quarrels among you. Some saying, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Christ. And that is what results in then Paul writing 1 Corinthians, what we call 1 Corinthians, which would actually be 2 Corinthians, right? And in 1 Corinthians, Paul addresses a lot of issues: immorality, disunity, lawsuits amongst believers, the issue of tongues, the resurrection. He addresses a lot of issues. 1 Corinthians apparently did not resolve all the problems, right? Because he needs to write 2 Corinthians. But before he writes 2 Corinthians, Paul alludes to something that he calls his painful visit. And he alludes to that in 2 Corinthians. So 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 1, Paul writes, but I determined this for my own sake, that I would not come to you in sorrow again. So apparently, after Paul's first missionary journey, Paul made some return trip to Corinth, and he calls it a painful visit. It's not recorded in the book of Acts as a part of Paul's second missionary journey or third missionary journey. I think he probably was in Ephesus and made a short trip to Corinth to address this issue. And this is the painful visit that he's referring to. It's a painful visit. It may be about this certain man who's living with his father's wife in an immoral way. So he had told them to address this issue. Maybe the church still didn't, and he makes this painful visit to address it himself. And so we don't, again, it's not recorded in Paul's second or third missionary journey. This would have been after his second missionary journey, probably when he was in Ephesus. And so Paul makes this painful visit, but Luke doesn't record it as a part of the second or third missionary journey because it was, a short trip to deal with this issue. And then we're also referenced in 2 Corinthians 2, verse 4, I wrote to you with many tears. So I think this is probably in addition to 1 Corinthians. So there's an epistle, a letter, and before 1 Corinthians, then you have 1 Corinthians, and now Paul refers to a severe letter, some sort of letter of rebuke. I think this is probably in addition to 1 Corinthians. So that would be his third epistle, right? Before writing 2 Corinthians, which would be his fourth epistle. So a second letter, a severe letter, was written in between 1 and 2 Corinthians, possibly follow-up letter after his painful visit. So departing Ephesus to go and address this issue, and then a follow-up letter, which he calls a sorrowful letter, or severe letter, I should say. So a lot of interactions with the Church of Corinth. And things have improved after multiple visits. Again, this is not a model church by any stretch of the imagination. There's a lot of problems that Paul has to address. And then finally, he writes 2 Corinthians, the epistle we're looking at today. This would be what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, his seventh interaction with this church. It appears there's a group of false teachers. Paul's going to call them eminent apostles, or they're in a sarcastic way, right? They're referring to themselves as apostles or super apostles. And so Paul's going to address this group of individuals who are attacking Paul's authority. And so there's a group, not the church as a whole. The church as a whole, I think, has responded well to Paul's instruction, to his writings, but there's a group within the church that are opposing Paul's leadership. And it prompts the writing of Paul's fourth letter, which is 2 Corinthians. And so 2 Corinthians is dealing with one main issue from beginning to end, a secondary issue, but one primary issue, and that is Paul's apostleship. He's defending his authority as an apostle of God in 2 Corinthians. So that's what I would put up here. 2 Corinthians, Paul's apostleship. His apostleship is under attack. He feels the need to defend it, rightly so the church would listen to him rather than these false teachers. And so the fourth letter is written around AD 56 to 57, written from Macedonia, and that's northern Greece. That's where Paul will reference in 2 Corinthians. So as we're trying to piece together the chronology of Paul's life, we've got the book of Acts, and then we have all the Pauline epistles. And within each of the epistles, we have clues or indicators that help us date the books and determine where Paul is when he writes it. And he's going to refer to him being in Macedonia when he's writing this letter. Okay. And then the last interaction that we have record of in the book of Acts and the Pauline epistles in Corinth is Paul's anticipated visit. So he's writing 2 Corinthians and he anticipates visiting them. He's going to see them again. And of course, we know he does, right? So he wrote 2 Corinthians after going into Macedonia, and he mentions Macedonia to them, that he's in Macedonia, and he's going to visit Corinth again after going through Macedonia, through northern Greece. He's going to go down here to what we've referenced as Achaia, right? So what's the occasion? Again, to every book of the New Testament is written for a reason or an occasion. And the occasion, the historical occasion, is this. There's a segment of Corinthian Christians who are questioning the legitimacy of Paul's apostolic authority. These false apostles that Paul refers to as super apostles, right, in a sarcastic way. And Paul says, I have the signs of an apostle, they don't. I perform miracles amongst you. You know that. I am an apostle of God, they are not. Right? And so the purpose for which Paul is writing is twofold. The first purpose is to demonstrate that Paul is a true apostle of Christ. He's defending his authority, and to encourage the Corinthians to complete the offering that they promised. So 13 chapters, which is a pretty long epistle for one main issue. But in the midst of the 13 chapters, chapter 8 and 9, Paul takes a break from the discussion, the primary issue, and he addresses that they had promised to help financially the Jewish Christians, the Christians in Jerusalem who were struggling because of famine, and was asking the church of Corinth to help. And so he makes a plea to them to provide gifts graciously and generously to help the Christians in Jerusalem. So that would be a secondary issue. The primary issue is to demonstrate that Paul is an apostle and to listen to his teaching. The secondary issue would be to do what you said you would do, to give, to help meet the needs of the Jewish church in Jerusalem. Paul's message can be summarized into something that's broad enough to include all the contents, but succinct enough to be memorable and repeatable. The Apostle Paul's apostolic authority is legitimate, right? He's arguing he is an apostle of God, and his motivation is pure. We're going to look at that. Paul's going to tell them, show them, prove to them that his motivations are for the glory of God, and the love of Christ constrains him. Right? And his motivations are pure. Therefore, his message is authoritative and it's to be obeyed. Right? These Corinthians need to listen to him and not listen to these false teachers. Okay. So the outline of the book of 2 Corinthians is pretty simple. Here are my three main sections. The first chapters 1 to 7 provides the nature of Paul's ministry, right, to describe the nature of his ministry. Then that chapter 8 and 9, he discusses the collection of offerings for the sake of the church in Jerusalem, and to give generously to help them. And then chapters 10 through 13, a defense for Paul's ministry. So let's look at 1 Corinthians and do a survey of 2 Corinthians, highlight some of the important components here as we look through this. So as Paul, again, main primary purpose is to defend his apostolic authority. So he begins by talking about the sufferings that Paul has endured for their sake, for the sake of this church. Look at verse 4. We'll start in verse 3. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we will be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with comfort Then verse 5, for just as the sufferings of Christ are ours in abundance, so also our comfort is abundant through Christ. So Paul's saying, we have endured incredible difficulties, persecution, affliction, and Christ has comforted us through it. In other words, Paul's motivations are not to be glorified. His motivations are not to be promoted or to be highly regarded. He's going through affliction and persecution. And this is a proof that his desire isn't just to be well-liked, right? Remember Galatians, Paul argued, if I wanted to be well-liked, I cared about what people thought of me, I would have stayed in my ancestral tradition. I was advancing in my tradition, Jewish tradition, but Paul became a follower of Jesus. He had the Damascus Road experience, and he was willing now to die. He was killing Christians, Stephen included, and now he's willing to be killed. He was persecuting, now he's willing to be a martyr. And so Paul's saying, I've gone through great suffering and affliction, and my motives are pure. Right? Now in verses 12, chapter 2, verse 17, Paul defends his change of plans. Paul explains that he did intend to go from Ephesus to visit Corinth, and then go to Macedonia, and then go back to Corinth. Right? So Paul indicates in 2 Corinthians that his plan was that, but that he had a change of plans and that God had that change of plan for him. In other words, we all make plans, and we have to saturate those plans in prayer, but God, at any moment, at any time, can change our plans. And that's what Paul's going to argue here, that his plans were not in the flesh. In other words, it wasn't contrived. It wasn't what I necessarily wanted to do because of my human desire. I was seeking to do what God had for me. Look at verse 15. I intended at first to come to you so that you might twice receive a blessing. That is, to pass your way into Macedonia. So if we look at the map here, Paul's plan was to go from Ephesus to Corinth, right? He was in Ephesus on this third missionary journey. His plan was to go from there to Corinth, and then up to Macedonia, and then back through Corinth. That was his plan. That's what he says here, to pass your way into Macedonia. So to go through Achaia, go through Corinth, and then up to Macedonia, then back through Corinth. This was what he was planning to do, but God had different plans. Verse 17, therefore I was not vacillating. Right? He's not just making it, a plan and changing his mind. Paul's explaining that he was saying yes and no, right? Verse 18, but as God is faithful, our word to you is not yes and no. In other words, we have to make plans, but God can change those plans at any moment. So Paul's plans were to go to them first, but God had a different idea in mind. Right? And that's why we often end our prayers with the Lord willing, right? Because we're in that simple two-word statement, we're recognizing that God could redirect us, change our plans, and we need to always be submitting our will to his will. So that was Paul's intended plan in verse 16, but Paul's change of plan was then what we see on this map, on this third missionary journey. From Ephesus, he goes up through Macedonia. That's where he's writing from, and he's going to go down to Corinth. He's going to go back through Macedonia, encouraging these churches along the way, and head back to Jerusalem. And so it appears that these false teachers, these false apostles, are accusing Paul of being a vacillator, that he's just changing his mind, he's changing his plans. He told us this, now he's not doing it. And so it seems that Paul is responding to that potential accusation by these false teachers. Right? Now, in chapter 3, Paul's going to talk about his ministry that he had before them. In chapter 3, look at verse 1. He refers to a letter of commendation. Chapter 3, verse 1. Are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Or do we need, as some, letters of commendation to you or from you? What's this all about? Paul's saying here, do we need a letter of reference? You are our letter of reference. Your very lives, this church doesn't exist if Paul didn't go there and preach the gospel. These individuals wouldn't have come to faith in Christ if it weren't for Paul being there. And so Paul's saying, I don't need a letter from a rabbi or a religious leader or even the apostles. My very life and your very lives are my letter of recommendation. You are our letter, verse 2, written in our hearts. Now, Craig Keener has what's called a Bible background commentary, and in that, I think he has a good statement here that helps us understand what's going on behind the scenes here as far as historically. What are these letters of recommendation in mind? And he writes, Jewish travelers often carried letters of recommendation, indicating that Jewish households could trust them and give them lodging on their journey. In Greco-Roman society, higher class patrons would write letters recommending their subordinates. Such recommendations naturally carried more weight than the person's own claims. Anyone who was trusted could write letters on someone else's behalf, and by such letters, a sender could also authorize a messenger. So when someone's traveling the known world to somewhere where someone else is recognized or known, that letter of recommendation would be helpful to provide housing in some instances, maybe to speak in the Jewish synagogues in other instances. We even do that today, don't we? Today, in my department meeting at Dallas Seminary, we were looking over a PhD applicant who wants to go into our PhD program. Well, we all read over 3 references, pastoral reference and 2 other references, because those references are people of higher experience and standing and proven ministry past, vouching for this PhD student, right? And you have that for college and university as well, often, at least Christian colleges, right? We look for letters of reference. And this is what's happening here. Paul's saying, I don't need a letter of reference to teach you, to share with you, to minister to you. I am that letter of reference, and your very lives are indicator that I don't need a letter. Right? And so again, he's defending his apostolic authority, and he feels the need to. And later he's going to say, I wish I didn't have to do this. I wish I didn't have to brag about what I've done and what God has done through me. But even then, I'm bragging not in myself, but in God's strength, because I'm weak and he is strong. I'm made, his strength is made known in weakness, right? So this is Paul's primary purpose in this epistle, is to defend his apostolic authority, get the Corinthians not to listen to these false teachers, these super apostles. And then chapters 4 to 6, we see Paul's motivation for service. Again, defending his apostolic authority, defending his pure motives. Again, if he just cared about what people thought, he would have stayed in his ancestral tradition, but yet he abandoned that, and he's now willing to die for the cause of Christ. So Paul's motivation for service is developed in chapter 4 through 6. Let's look at chapter 5, verse 9. Therefore, we also have as our ambition, Paul speaking of him and his co-workers, whether at home or absent, to be pleasing with him. For we must all appear before the bema of Christ, the judgment seat of Christ. The Greek word is bema, so that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad. So Paul says, my motivation isn't to receive praise from you. My motivation isn't to earn a wealth. In fact, Paul was working as a tent maker when he was there in Corinth. Paul says, my motivation is judgment seat of Christ, that I will stand before the judgment of Christ and give account for what I've done with my life. Right? And so, again, this is where this analogy or this metaphor comes in, because they remember Acts 18, when Paul was drugged before Gallio, the judgment seat of Gallio, same word, bema, the bema seat of Gallio. And it was in the middle of Corinth. This is the archaeological drawings here. It was an outdoor place. This was not indoors. This is where all the Corinthian believers would have come and probably been there at the base. The base there, the foundation, is where Paul would have stood. At the top of that is where Gallio would have stood, and he would have exercised judgment. Of course, you remember, Gallio says, you're accusing him of things of violating the Jewish law, not the Roman law. I'm not going to judge him. But they would have remembered this. So Paul takes what they're very familiar with, the bema of Gallio, to talk about the bema of Christ. And he says, my motivation isn't the bema of Gallio, not glory of men. It's not. My motivation is that I'll one day stand before Christ and give account for what I've done with what God has entrusted to me. Now, this isn't the great white throne judgment. That's a different judgment seat. The great white throne judgment is for unbelievers. The bema seat, the judgment seat of Christ, is for works, not for salvation. Remember, we can flip back to 1 Corinthians 3. In 1 Corinthians 3, to the same Corinthian believers, Paul talked about this judgment. Okay? And when he was talking about Apollos and Paul, remember he said, Apollos and I are co-workers. Right? We're not intimidated by each other. We're not insecure, right? We're thankful for each other. Paul says, I water, I plant, Apollos waters. Right? We have different ministries. We're serving the same Savior. And he says, I planted, verse 6 of chapter 3, Apollos watered, verse 8. Now he who plants and he who waters are one, but each will receive his own reward. Right? This judgment is about reward, according to his own labor. Right? Then he goes on to talk about foundations in verse 10, verse 11 for no man can lay a foundation other than that which is Jesus Christ. Then verse 12 talks about gold, silver, precious stones, right? Things that are imperishable, things that survive fire. Then he says, but then there's wood, hay, and straw. Those are perishable things. Those are things that burn up. And so then Paul says, each man's work will become evident, for the day will show it, because it will be revealed with fire. Verse 14, if any man's work which he has built on it remains, he'll receive a reward. So this is not for salvation, this is for reward. If any man's work is burned up, right, that's things that are done that have no eternal value, right? We may like watching sports or participating in sports, but there's not any eternal value for that. It's not wrong, but it's not going to last, endure beyond the judgment. There's no reward for that, right? Unless you're sharing the gospel to your, in the process of that. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire. So yet he will be saved. That person will be saved if they place their faith in Christ for salvation. But unfortunately, there will be Christians who don't have much to show for their life. Right? An entire life without investing the stewardship that God has given us. And they will suffer loss, but not be burned by fire, or they'll survive. So this is what Paul's referring to again now in 2 Corinthians 5. Paul says, my motivation is knowing that I'm going to give account for what God has entrusted to me. It's not about me getting glory from you, Corinthians. It's not about me receiving praise from men. It's about recognizing I'll stand before the judgment seat and be rewarded for faithfulness in this life. But then he talks about another motivation. Look at chapter 5, verse 14. For the love of Christ controls us, having concluded this, that one died for all, therefore all died. And he died for all, so that we who live might not no longer live for themselves, but for him who died and rose again on our behalf. In other words, Paul says, Christ has lavished his love on me there's no more reasonable thing I can do than to offer my life in response. Right? Romans 12, 1 and 2, a very powerful, helpful verse that talks about our reasonable act of worship. Right? When we recognize what God has done for us, when we recognize what Christ has done for us, our only reasonable act of response or worship is to serve him with what he's given to us. And so Paul's motivation is the love of Christ. Christ's love's been lavished on him, and now he's constrained by that love to share that with others. Now, remember Paul's past. Paul was a killer. He killed Stephen. He was a part of those who were stoning Stephen. He was dragging Christians to prison before he had that amazing, gracious conversion experience where Christ said, Paul, Paul, or Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And so Paul recognized the incredible grace of God, and as a result has led him to want to share that grace with others. Right? So here are two motivations that Paul gives. Again, it's in the context of defending his apostolic authority, saying, I'm an apostle of God. My motivations are pure. I'm motivated knowing that I'm going to give account for my life. And also, I'm motivated out of the constraining love of Christ. And I think I shared this with you in 1 Corinthians, but I think I think of my own children who, right, especially 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, and they obeyed out of fear, right? They obeyed because we believed in spanking, right? They um, they recognized that there would be consequence for disobedience, right? And but as our relationship develops and as they love my wife and I, they obey out of a love for us. Right? Their motivation, I think, is more and more out of love rather than out of fear. Right? And I think that's the case with our Christian lives as well. Right? That yeah, we're motivated out of reward. We want the Lord to say, "Well done, good and faithful servant," and reward us for our faithfulness. But as we mature in our spiritual lives, I think our greater motivation is the love of Christ, right? The love that's been lavished on us. Now we want to share that with others, right? There's no greater, there's no other reasonable act of worship than to do that. So they're both motivational factors. Paul says he's motivated by both. But I do think the love of Christ was the greater of motivation, right? So then chapter 8 and 9, we're not going to spend a lot of time here because, but Paul does interrupt his argument about his apostolic authority to challenge the Corinthians to give, to help meet the needs of the Jewish believers in Jerusalem. And he talks about the Macedonians. Now, is Corinth in Macedonia? Where's Corinth? Right. No, it's in Achaia. The peninsula here, the Peloponnesian Peninsula of Corinth is in Achaia. That's where Gallio would have been proconsular over Achaia. Macedonia is up here. Remember, the Church of Thessalonica is in Macedonia. Remember when Paul wrote the Thessalonian believers and he said, every time I think of you, he's writing from Corinth in Achaia. And he writes the Thessalonians in 1 Thessalonians and says, every time I think of you, I praise God for every one of you and everyone in Macedonia and everyone in Achaia, right? Everyone from where I'm writing to and from where I'm writing from, when they hear about the reputation of your church, the Church of Thessalonica, that it's proclaimed all over, right? Their good reputation is proclaimed all over Macedonia and Achaia. Well, maybe these Thessalonians he has in mind again when he says that they're a great example of those who are giving to help meet the needs. Look at chapter 8, verse 1. Now, brethren, we wish to make known to you the grace of God which has been given in the churches of Macedonia. Paul's writing to a church that's not in Macedonia. He's writing to the church in Achaia, Corinth. but he's in Macedonia, Paul is. Right? He's writing from there, verse 2, that in a great ordeal of affliction, their abundance of joy. So they're going through incredible trials, so much so that they thought they might be in the day of the Lord. Remember? Their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed the wealth of their liberality. In other words, they're very poor, yet they're giving very generously. Verse 3, for I testify that according to their ability and beyond their ability, they gave their own accord. And so Paul is in Macedonia and he's bragging on these Macedonian believers who are going through trials, who oftentimes persecution and trials lead to poverty too, right? Amongst Christians. That's the case. In Nigeria, when you have people killed, you have homes burned down, it leads to poverty. And oftentimes the trials of Christians around the world also leads to poverty. Well, the Thessalonian believers are not wealthy and probably being mistreated, probably not getting the best jobs because of their Christian faith. Right? That happens around the world as well. Right? And Paul says they're giving generously, even beyond what they human logic would say they should give. Right? Giving with great faith. Now, just allude to 1 Corinthians 16 here for a moment. Paul writes, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches in Galatia, so you also, I will send them with letters to carry your gift to Jerusalem. So Paul alludes to that. Well, in 1 Corinthians, Paul mentions the need for them to give, to help. And now Paul's saying it's time, right? And he's referring to this, I think, now in 2 Corinthians. So it's helpful always to refer back to other epistles written to the same audience when we have that, like 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, like 1st and 2nd Corinthians, like 1st and 2nd, 3rd John. Well, Paul alludes to the need to give and to help with the church in Jerusalem. And Paul's going to say, I'm going to send Titus to collect, right? And please give generously. And he encourages them to give generously. So that's the second main section, chapters 8 and 9. The final section, the third section, is chapters 10 to 12. And again, Paul's defending his apostolic authority and his ministry. And these accusations of these false teachers. Look at verse 17. Paul's going to say, I hate that I have to boast. But if I'm going to boast, I'm going to boast in the Lord. Verse 17. But he who boasts is to boast in the Lord. In other words, Paul doesn't want to spend all this time writing this epistle to talk about what has happened to him, how he's been afflicted, how he's gone through difficulties, yet endured them. Paul wants to minister to them, and rather than have to defend his apostolic authority. Okay? But yet sees the need to brag or boast in what God has done through him in his weakness. Look at verse 2 of chapter 11. I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy. There's jealousy that's not godly, and there's a godly jealousy, right? We are right to be jealous for the affection of our spouse and not for other people to have that effect, right? There's a healthy jealousy in a marital relationship. Right? There can also be unhealthy jealousies, right? But there's a godly jealousy, right? I love my wife and she loves me, and we should be faithful to each other. For I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy. Paul's saying, I'm jealous for this church in a healthy, godly way. I don't want you to be taken astray by these false apostles. Right? Verse 5 or verse 3, be led astray there. Look at verse 5. For I consider myself not in the least inferior to the most eminent apostles. Some translations say super apostles. This is referring to these false teachers. Paul's calling them in a sarcastic way, these supposed super apostles. Look at verse 6. It seems that they may be accusing Paul of not being a good speaker, a good orator. Verse 6, but even if I'm unskilled in speech, yet I'm not so in knowledge. In fact, in every way, we have made this evident to you in all things. So Paul has been revealed by Christ, right? For 3 years, Galatians speaks of his time in Arabia before he goes and ministers. He's there for 3 years before he goes and meets with the apostles. Paul says, I have knowledge. I may not be a great orator, I may not be a great speaker, but God has entrusted to me this knowledge, and you know that. So it seems that they are accusing him, attacking not only his character, but his qualifications as a spokesman, as a speaker of God. Verse 9, when I was present with you and was in need, I was not a burden to anyone. In other words, again, remember, he was a tent maker. He didn't ask for the Corinthians to help him. And then those who did help him were from Macedonia. So those in the north helped him. And while he was in Achaia, he didn't want to ask for help from the Corinthians as he's reaching them with the gospel, planting a church there. And he says, you didn't even help me. I didn't ask for you to. Look at verse 13. For such men, speaking of these individuals, false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. No wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Now we get a glimpse here, what we call angelology, or even demonology, the study of demons or studies of angels. We learn that Satan, from the context here, it's not intended to be a study on angels here, but in the context of this argument, Paul says Satan dresses up like an angel of light. He appears to be beautiful, and right, all that glitters is not gold, right? He makes things really attractive. Well, Paul says, if he does that, don't you think that his messengers are like that too? They look good on the outside, they are appealing, but these false apostles, they're deceitful workers. They're a part of Satan's army. They are not working for and for the cause of God, for the glory of God, right? And so Paul, again, is responding all the way through this epistle to the issues that these false apostles are raising, and he's defending his apostolic authority. Notice that Paul feels the need to boast, but he's not boasting in himself. He's boasting in God and the strength of God and his weakness, and how God is using his weakness for God's glory. Look at verse 24. Paul mentions all the afflictions. We wouldn't know all of this if he wasn't felt obligated to mention all of this in response to these false apostles. He says that he's been in prison many times, beginning in verse 23 of chapter 11. I speak as if imprisonment, beaten innumerable times, in danger of death, 39 lashes 5 times. That's new information for us. Okay? In other words, the full amount that under Jewish law you could whip someone to the point of death. 39 lashes 5 times, beaten with rods 3 times, stoned, shipwrecked three times. Well, we have record of 1 shipwreck, but Paul now tells us he's been shipwrecked 3 times. And that's even before that 4th time on the way to Rome under house arrest, right? So shipwrecked, stoned, frequent journeys in dangerous rivers, danger of being robbed, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers from false brethren, sleepless nights, hungry, thirsty, exposed to the elements. So Paul feels the need to boast, but boasting in what God has done in sustaining him through all of this. Look at chapter 12, verse 1. Boasting is necessary, though it is not profitable. Paul does not want to be boasting, but sees the need to defend his apostolic authority in order for the betterment of this church, so they don't get pulled into the false teaching of these individuals. Well, as we wrap up here, look at verse 12 of chapter 12. Well, let's look at verse 9 first. Speaking of Paul, and he has said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Okay. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weakness, with insults, with distresses and persecutions, with difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And I'm sure many of you have experienced this. I've experienced this more this year in my struggles with blood pressure and all of the rest, and recognizing how weak we really are, how frail we really are, and we must depend on the strength of the Lord, and that in our weakness He is strong, right? And He is sufficient. He's perfected. And so that's Paul's saying, I was gone through all of this mistreatment. That's a lot of weakness. The way Paul was mistreated in many different ways. But he's able to boast in that, to say, in this weakness, I am strong, and God is glorified. And then chapter 12, verse 12, we'll end with this. Paul says, the true signs of an apostle were made among you, performed among you with all perseverance by signs and wonders and miracles. Remember this language, signs, wonders, miracles? Spoken of Jesus in the Gospels. We looked at that many different times last semester. It's spoken of in the book of Acts many different times. The apostles performed signs, miracles, and wonders. Now Paul says, I perform signs, miracles, and wonders in your presence, and they are signs of an apostle. They identify him as a messenger of God, and you need to listen to his message. By the way, we also saw in 2 Thessalonians that this one empowered by Satan is going to perform false signs and wonders and miracles, this lawless one. But then we'll also see in the book of Revelation, the two witnesses who will perform signs, wonders, and miracles. So signs, wonders, and miracles were used by God to authenticate Paul and the apostles as messengers of God. Listen to them. Okay. Well, that's 2 Corinthians in a overview form. Hopefully you get a good sense of this is all about Paul's apostolic authority, trying to help this church protect it from these false teachers. And he feels the need to do that. And 13 chapters of that, with a short 2-chapter break to address the need to give to help the Christians in Jerusalem. Let me pray for us. Lord, we thank you for the Apostle Paul. We thank you for 2 Corinthians. Thank you for all that we can learn from his life, his motivation for service. Help us to be motivated out of knowing the fear of the Lord, the judgment seat of Christ, and also your love that constrains us. Thank you for the teachings we learn and the example from Paul. Help us to serve you faithfully. Help us in our weakness to use it for your glory. And it's in your Son, Jesus Christ's name, we pray. Amen.